Good afternoon. I hope you all are having a wonderful day. Welcome to our presentation on the Unwritten Order by Peter Longerich, brought to you by myself, Tiger Behrens, and my colleague, Mark Mayer. To begin, we're really going to be talking a little bit about the author, Peter Longerich himself, as this is his book, The Unwritten Order. Now, Peter, he was born and raised in Krefeld, Germany in 1955, and for schooling, he would attend the Ludwig Maximilian University of Munich, where he earned a PhD in history and an MA in history and sociology. Longerich spent a great deal of time later in his life doing research at the Center for Advanced Holocaust Studies in the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. He would perform extensive research on Himmler for a biography he was writing. And he also served as a professor of modern German history at Royal Holloway, University of London. Due to his vast knowledge and experience, Longerich is widely regarded as an authority figure on the Holocaust.
Because of his authority status, Longerich was called as an expert witness in the celebrated court case involving David Irving and Penguin Books. Irving intended to pursue a civil case against Lipstadt for her portrayal of him in her book Denying the Holocaust. For the trial, Longerich was asked to provide two expert reports, one on the systematic character of National Socialist policy for the annihilation of the Jews, and a second on Hitler's role in the persecution of Jews by the National Socialist regime. These two expert reports were foundational in Longerich's approach to the work we are about to discuss, the Unwritten Order. Longerich notes that Holocaust deniers often argue that there is no concrete example of an order given by Hitler to initiate the systematic mass execution of the Jews, and summarizes the two most common rebuttals made by historians. One argues the momentum of the killing machine was the driving force, thus no single order was necessary, and the other argues the extent to which the Führer himself was involved is irrelevant given the cumulative radicalization process that took place in Nazi Germany. Being the expert that he is, however, Longerich decided to take his own approach and examine, with documented evidence, Hitler's constant, consistent role in the process of policy making and radicalization through the various phases of Jewish persecution.
To briefly summarize this book in one sentence, Hitler played somewhat of a role in the final solution. This is the central tenet to which Longerich returns time and time again. However, Longerich provides a much greater insight into the events surrounding the prosecution of European Jews, and he does so by breaking into it a number of time frames. These time frames include the rise of the NSDAP from 1919 until 1932, the three phases of persecution from 1933 to 1939, the onset of war and murder from 1939 to 1941, and finally the radicalization and intensification between 1942 and 1943. Now, within this first section, Hitler begins by explaining what exactly he means by unwritten order. With this, Hitler avoided using written terms, written orders for the killing of Jews. He resorted to oral orders in front of individuals or small groups, and they were open to interpretation while also being regarded with the utmost secrecy. Official policy of not discussing the killing of the Jews in exact terminology resulted in the individuals using abstract terms such as annihilation when discussing what was happening, and this helped keep reality at a distance. This notion of self-deception became characteristic of the atmosphere surrounding Hitler, and it comes into play multiple times throughout the book. In the absence of concrete terminology, there are many terms thrown around. You have annihilation, extirpation, final solution, removal, resettlement, evacuation, and the list goes on. Longerich emphasizes these terms as they are all entirely context sensitive and carry different meanings based on the different times they are being used. One necessary question that needs answered early on when analyzing Hitler's ultimate role in the unwritten orders is whether or not he was truly anti-Semitic. This is a necessary prerequisite for his role in the quote-unquote final solution. And I don't want to spoil too much of the book because you really should read it. It's a great book, but there is a hint of evidence that would suggest that he did in fact harbor some anti-Jewish sentiments, believe it or not. During the rise of the NSDAP, Hitler would excite the public to his own ideologies by asserting that the Jewish presence was to blame for any of Germany's problems, and that the only solution to these problems needed to first be addressed via eviction of Jewish presence from the whole of Germany, particularly from the economic realm, but not excluding physical removal, as Hitler said himself. Now, Longerich lastly notes that early on in the rise of the NSDAP, Hitler would meticulously curate his language so as to garner mass appeal. This fine selection of words would at times lead to ambiguities regarding Hitler's true ambitions, but ultimately, Longerich provides sustained evidence that Hitler harbored anti-Semitic beliefs very early on, even in times when he refuses to acknowledge that he is referring to the Jewish people.
Between 1933 and 1939, there were three major phases of Jewish persecution and policy. In 1933 through 1934, policy focused mainly on the displacement of Jews from public life, and this can be demonstrated by the boycott of Jewish businesses that was implemented April 1st, 1933. Then, in 1935, policy shifted towards total segregation and legal discrimination against the Jews, which can be demonstrated with the Nuremberg laws that were implemented September 15th, 1935. The last and most radical phase of persecution began in the autumn of 1937, where Jews were stripped of basically all rights. Jewish wealth was totally expropriated, and the threat of violence was increased in the expulsion of the Jews. The gradual implementation of these phases was strategically important for Hitler, as they often went hand in hand with some sort of propaganda initiative. Furthermore, by slowly worsening the condition of the Jews, the terrible conditions being implemented were not as easily picked up on by foreign entities and prevented intervention during the early stages. In his discussion of the three phases of persecution, Longerich makes note of a question that often arises in regard to the intensification that takes place. Was Hitler pressured into the intensification and radicalization by the heat of grassroots activists? Longerich answers no, citing evidence of violence towards Jews halting immediately upon Hitler's command and then resuming at the snap of his finger, ultimately demonstrating he was in complete control of the events that unfolded. Hitler also is said to have directly claimed responsibility for putting boycott committee together, which is proven by Goebbels' diary entries, which state that he, the Chancellor of Germany, had himself ordered the proclamation, further damning Hitler and proving his direct involvement.
With the onset of war began the true beginning of systematic killing, first of Polish elite, and then began the idea of racial hygienics, during which time Hitler asserted the need to exercise the quote-unquote freedom to destroy any life not fit for living. This took the form of the euthanasia program, in which firing squads and mobile gas chambers were mobilized to murder these targeted groups of mentally unstable or disabled men, women, and children. Now, the authorship of and responsibility for the euthanasia program and its close parallels with the systematic murders of the Jewish people later on are a significant indicator of Hitler's responsibility for the quote-unquote unwritten orders. In fact, Longerich argues that the lack of written order regarding the final solution may have been a byproduct of Hitler learning that it was too difficult to keep mass murder a secret, and thus he had to make sure there was no written evidence of his involvement in the future. Euthanasia suffered extreme backlash from the public, and thus Hitler introduced the ideas of relocation, first to Poland and then to Madagascar, but ultimately back to Poland. And during this time of deportation, Longerich acknowledges that there is no solidified evidence that mass murder was the ultimate goal. Nevertheless, in the summer of 1941, these killings began. And while it was not explicitly linked to Hitler, Hitler was very quick to endorse these actions, which would ultimately intensify leading up to the latter part of 1941. In fact, Hitler was documented as saying, "The vast area must naturally be pacified as quickly as possible. This will best be achieved by shooting everyone who even looks oddly." It was at this point, tying back into this theme of language, that the eliminatory language of the Führer transcended away from wartime threat and instead towards a direct reflection of what was happening, an extermination of German foes. Time and time again, we see the idea of a lack of written or spoken order from Hitler, which could lead one to believe that the actions taken were not his doing. However, Longerich is fast to dispel these beliefs at every turn, instead accentuating the vast communication that the Führer held with SS superiors. He believes all actions were direct consequences of Hitler's established outlook regarding the Jewish question. In fact, he touches upon the fact that some of Hitler's fault is found in the close parallels that the final solution held to the aforementioned euthanasia program, which would figuratively be reintroduced in the autumn of 1941. They would reintroduce gas chambers, firing squads, and a number of independent institutions would begin these crazed sprees of mass murder. However, as Longerich asserts, these regional annihilation programs cannot be seen in isolation as independently running campaigns that had been started on the initiative of regional authorities. They were instead components of a super-regional policy that was being guided centrally. Now, I am by no means in any position to challenge Longerich. However, interesting food for thought. Longerich also admits himself that much of the extreme killings were actually condemned by Hitler and asked to stop. Furthermore, Longerich acknowledges that this initial radicalization was a consequence of Himmler assuming power not granted from the Fuhrer. Instead, Longerich merely assumes that an operation of this size, in his words, could only be carried out in the Third Reich if it was covered by the authority of the Fuhrer himself. The basis of his argument for how this initial radicalization should be tied to Hitler is founded upon an assumption, and one which he himself contests at that. With this in mind, it is possible that the unveiling of the gas chambers and firing squads were not part of any secret order by Hitler, but this is merely speculation, as even Longerich believes nothing can be proven with any certainty. Despite this, it was not until December of 1941 when Himmler's diary provides explicit evidence of Hitler's desire for increased radicalization regarding the Jewish question.
It is at the Wannsee Conference that took place on January 20th, 1942, that Heydrich is said to have proposed the mass killing of Jews as part of the solution to the Jewish question after receiving prior approval from the Fuhrer, which can be confirmed by a direct quote from Heydrich's address. Within this address, Heydrich makes a very clear distinction between deportation plans of the past and the new, more comprehensive plan that was to be implemented. These new plans include sending Jews to labor camps where Heydrich was certain natural deaths would take place. These labor camps became part of the plan to annihilate the Jews, along with the mass shootings as deportation complications were prevalent. After the Wannsee Conference, plans to deport Jews out of German-occupied territory and eventually all of Europe were underway. 1942 marked thousands of deportations from various European nations into work camps such as Auschwitz, where some were used for actual labor, while those unfit for work were to be put to death. From various diary entries from Goebbels, the documentation of Himmler's orders, it is clear that liquidation of the Jews in various ghettos was one of the main goals. Goebbels even remarks, the Fuhrer is the untiring pioneer and spokesman for a radical solution that is demanded by the very nature of things, and which is therefore inevitable. Thank God the war means that we now have a whole series of possibilities that were not possible in peacetime. We must exploit these possibilities. It was then between May and June of 1942 that the extermination policy was vastly expanded and work camps were extended to become more efficient killing machines that we know as extermination camps. Longerich then states that the program of systematic annihilation was in full effect by the end of July 1942, and on July 28th, Himmler again ties Hitler to the actions by stating, "The Fuhrer laid the implementation of this very difficult order on my shoulders when he was discussing the destruction of Jews in the Soviet zones." During this period, the term resettlement was being used in regards to the fate of Jewish people, yet Longerich urges us to view this as camouflage language. Longerich also writes of another sort of camouflage, where Hitler and the party maintained the notion that the final solution would only be realized after the war, often referring to the killings as provisional measures, potentially to mask the fact that full extermination during the war was now the new goal. As the new plan was implemented, intensification continued and more Jews were transported to concentration camps. Germany even attempted to acquire Jews from European allies as part of their goal of complete removal of Jewish people from Europe, though they were met with a great deal of hesitation and resistance. As the war began to turn out of favor of the Germans toward the end of 1942 and in the beginning of 1943, the systematic murder program was intensified as the post-war solution was now becoming less and less viable. Historical documents show Himmler increasing murder quotas, which were approved by Hitler himself. There was no one written order from the Fuhrer that led to genocide of millions of Jews in Nazi Germany during World War II. What there was, however, was a consistent radicalization of anti-Semitic policy that was pushed forward by the Fuhrer, Adolf Hitler. This took the form of repeated extreme anti-Semitic rhetoric, direct, decisive decision-making on anti-Jewish policy, authorization of other officials to carry out extermination plans of their own, and oral orders and briefings that were documented by diary entries and other historical documents from Hitler's time in power. To say that Hitler alone is responsible for the atrocities would be illogical, but to say there is no Holocaust without Hitler would likely be true. Hitler was the driving force of the machine and its radicalization, and undoubtedly played a vital role in each step of the way.